title the presentations and call it the omics of lung cancer, MET and precision medicine itself. So we've already discussed this mind map yesterday, but really to emphasize that MET mutations, MET amplification, and even MET translocation are beginning to be identified, especially in the various data sets and in non-small cell lung cancer, especially adenocarcinoma. So what is MET? MET is a receptor tyrosine kinase. It belongs to a family of receptor tyrosine kinase. There are over 55 families of receptor tyrosine kinases, and MET and RON are family members. They're quite important in terms of cell proliferation, motility, scattering, angiogenesis, EMT, invasion, as well as metastasis. Located on chromosome 7 and initially identified as a translocation between chromosome 1 and 7 in a chemically induced osteosarcoma cell line by George Vanderwood's group in 1984 with the TPR-MET translocation, but ultimately identified as c-MET in cellular homologs, as well as the binding partner, that is the ligand, being hepatocyte growth factor, which is also known as scatter factor, that was identified by Don Bottaro, and then the knockouts were lethal, and at the same time, initially Laura Schmidt identified that you can have activating mutations in the tyrosine kinase domain for hereditary papillary renal cell carcinoma, as well as sporadic renal cell carcinoma. Since then, a lot has come to fruition, and as Art Scaron used to say, we've come a long way. And so I'm going to describe that. In terms of MET activation, you can have MET activation with overexpression. You can have overexpression of the ligand, hepatocyte growth factor, or you can have overexpression of MET. You can also have activating mutations not only in the tyrosine kinase domain, but in the juxtamembrane domain or in the semaphorin domain, which is in the N-terminus, which is the ligand binding site. As well, you can also have translocation of MET, and you can also have inability to be degraded, and that's through Sybil. That's an E3 ubiquitin ligase, which is 120 kilodalton protein. So initially, when looking at MET and phospho-MET, here's utilizing tissue microarrays. Lung has overexpression of MET, but what's important in terms of activation of MET is the phosphorylated site, and there's robust overexpression and phosphorylation of MET that can occur in lung cancer. And looking at downstream phospho-MET signaling, you actually see that when HGF binds to MET, especially in lung cancer, this is a global proteomics assay. You can have cell cycle abnormalities that get activated. You can even have cytoskeletal abnormalities such as paxillin, which is a 68 kilodalton protein important in focal adhesion, and P125 FAC being phosphorylated. As well, you can have these intracellular signal transduction abnormalities and cellular proliferation and differentiation abnormalities with MET and HGF. This we publicized a while ago, and this was presented at the ASCO educational session several years ago, and that is you can have mutations in the tyrosine kinase domain, but they don't really occur in lung cancer. Tyrosine kinase domain mutations usually occur in renal cell carcinoma or head and neck carcinoma or gliomas or glioblastomas, whereas juxtamembrane domain, which we initially identified in 2003 for lung cancer, especially exon 14 skipping, as well as in the context of JM domain mutations such as R988C as well as T1010I, you can have it in the JM domain for small cell lung cancer, non-small cell lung cancer, as well as malignant mesothelioma. And interestingly, at the N-terminus is the semaphorin domain, and you can even have mutations in the semaphorin domain, and the activating mutations appear to be the N375S as well as the E168D. So beyond what Dr. Gadgil just presented, there are ancestral variations of the MET gene that can occur in adenocarcinoma versus squamous cell carcinoma versus large cell carcinoma. And here's a study that was published in the CCR several years ago by our group, in that you can really appreciate that the pie charts are completely different for adenocarcinoma and African Americans versus Caucasians versus East Asians. And it turns out it's the N375S mutation that occurs in the semaphorin domain that's ancestrally variable, but it's also associated with smoking, and there's no mutual exclusivity. So that is, you can have KRAS mutation and MET mutation. You can have EGFR mutation as well as MET mutation. Majority of MET mutations appear to be smoking related, at least in our hands at this moment in time. So what about these juxtamembrane domain mutations? You hear a lot about that. There are several papers published, and I'll actually show you those things. What is the evidence that indeed it's important for gain of function for tumorigenesis as well as proliferation? And here is a summary of the chart for over a decade's worth in terms of c-Met wild type versus the juxtamembrane domain mutated Met, and you can have enhanced tumorigenicity, you can have abnormal morphology, you can have increased cell survival as well as motility and migration enhanced, and you can have a plethora of signal transduction events, especially in the focal adhesion, that leads to migration and motility and ultimately metastasis, and that is through the focal adhesion protein pexilin, which is the 68 kilodalton protein. And so MET gene can be amplified, and you can see amplification not only of MET, but it seems to be concordant with pexilin amplification as well. What the implication of that is not clear, but it might be important for mechanisms of resistance, as was recently shown. And certainly you all know about EGFR amplification as well as CRACL amplification, and CRACL being this adapter molecule, which is quite important in binding to SH2 domains as well as SH3 domains as well. So the holy grail for all of us, clearly, and that's what I'm asked to talk about, is c-Met therapeutics and how we've come a long way. And you can think about the therapeutics themselves in the context of the hepatocyte growth factor. You can think about the anti-Met antibodies as well as receptor tyrosine kinase inhibition, and especially in the tyrosine kinase domain. Or you can even think about it in terms of microRNA or in terms of heat shock protein 90, and those are all under clinical trials. So initially, the evidence came preclinically utilizing the first generation Pfizer compound SU11274, where we were able to show that indeed you can have dramatic reduction of MET activity as well as MET inhibition in terms of proliferation. Excuse me. And then you can also show this in the in vivo modeling, and you can even now show it in PDX modeling as well. So clearly, this work has been going on for about 15 years or so, and these are some of these new drugs that have come to fruition. Some of the old drugs that have been tried have not worked necessarily, but I think that's because of the biomarker-driven pathways that's important for MET. And let me show you that as an example. So Ignatius Wu, initially, and us, we started this concept for MET inhibition with crizotinib in 2005. And clearly, crizotinib has anti-MET activity, as you can see, and not only that, but ALK activity as well as ROS1 activity, and now even TRAC1, TRAC2 activity. So Ignatius initially showed that indeed you can have clustered amplification of MET. This is John Iafredi's data from the Mass General. And then in terms of the reduction by crizotinib, this was initially published, that you can even have dramatic reduction of the tumor burden in this positive example from day 7 to day 25. But then it was actually robust clinical trials were carried out, and this was the phase 3 trials. And several years ago, and I actually got this from John from the DAVA website, and that is that indeed RQL197, which may or may not be a MET inhibitor, but again, METMAP or onartuzumab was tried, and other therapies were tried. But unfortunately, the biomarker chosen wasn't necessarily the right biomarker for those drugs, and it was really looking at MET overexpression, but not MET mutation or MET amplification, or even CBL overexpression, that is inability to be degraded in terms of MET. If you have CBL overexpression, you degrade MET more, and if you have CBL underexpression, then you don't degrade MET. So those biomarkers were not utilized. So initially, it was quite disappointing several years ago that all of these clinical trials were negative or they didn't meet their endpoints. And this was really presented, and Paul will be presenting that tomorrow, I believe, as well, in terms of exon 14 skipping. But there is now more evidence from the various papers that have been published more recently this year that if you have splice site mutations, that is exon 14 or juxtamembrane domain mutations, you can have robust activity that is quite interesting and can be long-lasting in some of our patients as well. So beyond crizotinib, you do have other drugs that are coming to fruition, and so this is the MGCD drug, and this is thanks to Jamie Christensen from Mirati. And what they were able to say is that with their MGCD 265 drug, they do have MET or AXL inhibition, and they were able to see some um, responses. This is a little bit premature, but we do want to be able to say that at least in a biomarker driven, that is, if you have MET gene amplification in this study, you do see some responses. And again, this is the CT scan of one of the responders, and clearly you can have MET exon 14 deletion or MET exon 14 deletion mutation or MET gene copy gain, and these are some of the examples where you do actually see some responses. And then this is a second example, or actually this is the third example I'm showing. So beyond crizotinib, it's beyond the MGCD. This is the ABT-700 drug, and this is from Louis Namovsky from AbbVie, where you can see the best percent change in the target lesions for this ABT-700, which is an antibody IgG1. And again, these are phase 1 clinical trials, and more needs to be done, but at least there's evidence that's being garnered up, that is that you can have a biomarkers in the context of MET mutations or exon 14 abnormalities or other abnormalities that can lead to potential responsiveness to the drugs themselves. So I'll summarize it here, and that is to be able to say that MET can be dysregulated by receptor ligand overexpression or mutation or amplification. I didn't really show you the translocation, but there are translocations that are occurring in patients with non-small cell lung cancer. And then MET activation can lead to prolonged and chronic signaling, and MET-targeted approaches can work in a biomarker-driven fashion. Again, thank you for inviting me to present on MET.
Questions for Ravi?
Neil?
So you had mentioned that there are splice site mutations that lead to the exon 14 skip. There's not a ton of the MET 14 exon 14 skips in TCGA, but most of those, as far as I remember, don't have splice site mutations. And actually, the reason for the exon 14 skip is cryptic. So that kind of a lot of stuff is embedded in that, which is, here's another event that's going to be difficult to detect. Do you have a favorite, method for detecting MET alterations?
Yeah, we actually do. And I think the easiest thing is once you identify the MET alteration, you create the construct, and then you put it into the cell lines, and then you look at the gain of function. And we like to do that. That's one way. The second way that I didn't present, but we just published that, is you can actually make these constructs and put them as transgenic in the C. elegans model. So we like the C. elegans model because it's a multicellular model. And it turns out C. elegans can also be a quote-unquote lung cancer model because you can induce them with smoke. So you can actually smoke the worms, so to speak, and you put them in these smoking chambers and they get addicted to smoke in a similar fashion as humans do. That's much more a biological and behavioral problem that was published in Cell years ago. And so what we do is we actually take these MET alterations and then make transgenic C. elegans, induce them with smoke and or nicotine or NNK, and then try to figure out genotype, phenotype, and then ultimately come back with the therapeutics, because C. elegans actually feed off of bacteria. So you can actually mix your drug like your MGCD or your crizotinib in the bacterial population and then feed it to the worms and then follow them over time. I actually like that multicellular organism because you can actually study this clonal population over 7 to 10 days. Postdocs and graduate students hate this model because you have to work very hard for 7 to 10 days, 24/7.
This might be a premature question, but do you have any information on the mechanisms of resistance, say, to crizotinib in these patients?
Yeah, so there have been several papers that have been published, and one of the mechanisms appears to be KRAS. So whenever you have MET mutations and MET alterations, you give them crizotinib or you give them another TKI, they tend to have amplification of KRAS as a resistant mechanism. The second mechanism that we just published is that it's really RON. So when you inhibit MET, you actually get overexpression and robust overexpression of RON as well as amplification of RON. So as we decide on the next therapeutics for MET, I think it might be important to do MET and RON inhibition.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.